Foundation, and we're delighted that you're joining us this afternoon for our panel on CT challenges in the Middle East for the next administration. This is part of our series of rolling conversations and dialogues and events this week as a part of our 14th annual terrorism conference that will be continuing and ending tomorrow. And we're delighted that we have a great group of speakers before you today. It certainly is going to be a very exciting conversation. We're delighted that we have with us Joel Rayburn, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs and Special Envoy for Syria. And we're very happy that he is here. He has some very big shoes to fill with the departure of Ambassador Jeffries. For many of you who don't know about Joel's background, he previously served in the administration as Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, and Syria at the National Security Council and also covered Lebanon. So he worked there from January 2017 to July 2018. We're also proud to have with us Professor Bruce Hoffman, who's been studying terrorism for, it seems like, decades. I know it's been a very long time, and I stopped tracking. I think it's 4 decades now. And so he's a tenured professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. He is also co-founder, was the first director of St. Andrew University Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. He's also the author of the book Anonymous Soldiers, The Struggle for Israel, 1917 to 1947, which was published in 2015. This book was nominated for Jewish Book of the Year for 2015. And we're delighted that his resume is very extensive, but we're certainly also happy that joining us with a commentary is also Seth Jones, who holds the Harold Brown Chair and is director of the Transnational Threats Project. He's a senior advisor to the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, otherwise known as CSIS. He also teaches at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. Seth has had also a very extensive career. He's also served in Afghanistan, where he's a special plans and officer and advisor to the Commanding General, U.S. Special Operations Command in Afghanistan. He served on several congressional panels. He's also the author of the most recent book, A Covert Action, Reagan, the CIA, and the Cold War Struggle in Poland. Very great book. I'm very interested and highly recommend it to those. And most recently, The Graveyard of Empire, America's War in Afghanistan, which he published in 2009. So on that note, I am going to turn the floor over to our distinguished speaker, Joel Rayburn, who will give us a few comments. And then he will take a few questions from me, and his comments are on the record. So Joel, thank you very much for joining the Jamestown's 14th Annual Terrorism Conference.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm very glad to be with you. What I'll do today is, in keeping with your conference's theme, I'll touch a little bit on how we see the current prospects for the major terrorist organizations that are operating in Syria. Then I'm going to cover a little bit about the state sponsors of terror that are active in Syria and what they're up to. Then I'm going to cover some issues pertaining to the displaced population and foreign terrorist fighters situation in eastern Syria in particular. And then I'm really interested to get your questions, comments, and those of the audience. The situation, and I'm going to dive right in and be a bit tactical. The situation with ISIS in eastern Syria, as we see it, is kind of as follows. And this is based on not just that we follow it, all the time. And I mean, we have a huge interagency machinery that does that. We also have the military commands out in the field. But I was in northeast Syria on Monday and touched base with our military counterparts with CJTF-OIR, the commander, Paul Calvert, he and his team are on the ground for about 3 months now, and they're doing a great job. And also our local security partners, Syrian Democratic Forces and Muslim Abdi and his folks. So and we stay in touch with all those people. In northeast Syria, on the on let's say the non-regime side of the river, the Euphrates River, we still have the benefit of the military victory that destroyed Daesh as a territorial caliphate, that destroyed Daesh as an army in the field and as a proto-state that could tax, recruit, or conscript, let's say, and have some of the resources, drop on the resources of a small state. That's gone. What's not gone is Daesh as a clandestine terrorist network, Daesh attempting to employ the tactics of a guerrilla insurgency. And they are still active, very active in the river valley of both banks of the river in that regard. They're using their clandestine apparatus to do targeted assassinations, to try to undermine what the SDF and the coalition troops that are there are trying to do to stabilize the situation, and to try to create some political space locally for themselves to come back. And unfortunately, there's an awful lot that they can draw upon there. So looks a lot like situations we've seen before, where major operations can drive them off the battlefield in pitched battles. But then the difficult work comes to try to stabilize and make it so that they can't have a resurgence. Now that's complicated. So the situation in the Northeast is complicated by the fact that across the river in what is nominally Assad regime held territory, ISIS has a lot more freedom of action, a lot more freedom of maneuver. The regime has a lot less capability and a lot less willingness, a lot less interest in using combat power in that zone to try to crunch down ISIS activity as they're trying to reorganize, especially in remote areas. I think if you look at the maps of eastern Syria in the Badia region, that's on the regime side of the river, you can see where the major roads run, and then there's a lot of space in between the major roads. You can kind of circle that space, and I think you can label it, this is an Al-Qaeda, or this is a Daesh sort of maneuver zone there, where they have the freedom to go out in these remote areas. And neither the Assad regime nor the Russians have the wherewithal to pursue them into those areas and try to make sure that they're not reorganizing. So it's a danger. And that's also a space where it's clear that some of the ISIS networks have the intention to try to set up an external operations capability out there in the middle of nowhere. So that's a problem that has to be watched, particularly so because we don't have the local presence on the ground. There are adversary forces who have that territory, and they're not doing much of a job about it. Elsewhere in Syria, the situation in the Northwest, I think people are really familiar with. It's come down to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is still established there. What we've noted, and this is a trend that has been commented on publicly, excuse me, I've sort of talked myself out over the last few days, so I'm a little hoarse. Bear with me, please. HTS in northwestern Syria has more and more over time become at odds with the foreign fighter element that you see more in the Al-Qaeda structure in northwest Syria. And HTS has also, their concerns have become much more localized. They seem to have an interest in trying to normalize themselves so that they can have some kind of role in the shaping of Syria's political future. There are indications from time to time that they would like to have some kind of normal channel with European countries, for example, and to distance themselves from the global jihad and so on. That's at the kind of the strategic level for them. At a lower level, they continue to do. We see them continuing to do a lot of things they've done all along, which has made them quite odious to the Syrian people. They continue to imprison people, intimidate people, kill people, and do things that are extreme that alienate the local population. So they wind up using sort of oppressive measures to try to control the local population and establish themselves, I guess, in something what you'd call an emirate, but one that they would like to see having a normal role, a legitimized role somehow. in the future of Syria. I think they look at the Taliban as a model for an emirate in exile, a would-be emirate that managed over time to just hang in there and begin to be somewhat legitimized or normalized with the international community, and they take that as maybe a path ahead for themselves. On our diplomatic end, we've tried to be clear about the fact that HTS, there's no path to normalization for HTS that we can envision, and no one on our side, nor do I think in Europe, is seriously thinking about going through some process like that. But it's one that I think they hold that out as a path forward. The other major grouping to talk about, I think your audience is probably familiar because this is, it's a very, folks who follow Jamestown have this level of expertise about Harassah-Din, which is the most prominent group of what we call Al-Qaeda in Syria. It's largely composed of non-Syrians. These are foreigners. Their eyes are and ambitions are outside Syria. They don't have much interest in the Syrian internal conflict other than being able to use it for space that they can occupy to project power outside Syria. And so their eyes seem to be especially on Europe, and they have ambitions to try to be able to project terrorist power into Europe, and that draws a lot of attention. And so there's a lot of military pressure on Harassah-Din right now, and it has forced them to change the way they operate. The other major place to look at is far southern Syria, southwestern Syria, in the zone between Damascus and the Golan Heights, the zone between Damascus and the Jordanian border. This is an area that is pretty chaotic. It's a bit of Wild West going on there. The Assad regime destroyed disrupted anyway, a lot of the armed opposition that controlled a good measure of that territory. Didn't replace it with anything but the Assad regime's usual brand of chaos and arresting people and killing people and so on. And so that situation obtains down there. It's presenting an opportunity for some groups that are under pressure elsewhere to try to infiltrate down into that area and reestablish themselves in a very volatile place. Lebanese Hezbollah is also active in that southern zone. The Iranian regime has an interest in them being there to be able to use the Syrian border zone, both whether to constitute a threat against Israel or to constitute a threat against Jordan, or just to be able to facilitate smuggling of all kinds, which they also do. So there's a big nexus in Southwest Syria between the terrorist groups and smuggling networks that are smuggling everything under the sun, including narcotics, both from and into Syria. Those are the major groups. Now, let me talk quickly about state sponsors. The Assad regime is first and foremost. The Assad regime, the Iranian regime, so two of the worst state sponsor of terrorism. They're central to the Syrian conflict. They're still doing the things that they've always been doing to support terrorist organizations, and they're also doing the same old stuff that we saw them do before, Islamic Jihad and Hamas and so on. One thing they're doing now, though, recently, is the Assad regime in Iran have begun to try to use some of ISIS's networks, and they've been kind of contracting out through ISIS networks in the Euphrates River Valley to get them to try to do activities and attacks to disrupt, undermine the Syrian Democratic Forces and the coalition in eastern Syria. It's quite cynical. So I don't think you can expect much of a counter-ISIS campaign from the Iranian regime or the Syrian regime. What we're doing in response to both those things is we try to tailor some of our sanctions so that we're putting economic pressure on the Assad regime and on the Iranian regime, as well as trying to use political pressure to isolate them because of what they do. The Iranian regime has also, they're still active in bringing in Shia militants from all over the region who are, they're well-known terrorist organizations. It's the Iraqi Shia militants, it's Lebanese Hezbollah, it's the Fatimiyun from Afghanistan, and so on, and put them, and they constitute Quds Force Foreign Legion, as Michael Knights dubbed it many years ago, and they're very active in Syria. Tens of thousands of fighters under essentially Iranian command, including a large number of Syrians that are in those militias as well. So and it constitutes a serious threat to the surrounding region, not just because of the fighters and that they can serve as terrorist fighters, but also because they're there to help enable the establishment of Iranian regime power projection platforms, so they can use strategic weapons against the surrounding region and try to, blackmail the region around them. Last note I'd highlight is there is a real counterterrorism concern with the remnants of the caliphate that were children, families who are in displaced persons camps in eastern Syria. Situation there is they're very densely packed into a lot of these camps. There's not a whole lot of control. The SDF has to expend a lot of resources trying to keep them as secure as possible, and it's starting to feel like a caliphate in incubation because of the fact that you have such a young population, child population, that is in many cases overseen by ISIS wives, women who are dedicated to the ISIS cause. So there's a lot of fear that there's indoctrination going on there. Certainly every possibility of that. Then you also have the detention facilities where the fighter remnants of the ISIS caliphate are being housed. And the difficulty there is that there's so many who are non-Syrians, and it's and repatriation back to their home countries is not happening in a quick way. There's a huge amount of reluctance on the part of their home countries, almost universally, to take them back. And so the longer that they stay in Syria, the more difficult it becomes for the SDF to maintain control. And it's unfortunately, it could be a bit of a ticking time bomb. What we're trying to do against this whole panoply, in addition to the counterterrorism military operations that are going on all the time, stabilization campaigns that are going on all the time in the liberated territories, the number one thing that I think we have to do to try to end this phenomenon of this, this vast tapestry of terrorist organizations and radicalism across Syria is to get the underlying conflict brought to an end, brought to a peaceful, stable end, using the diplomatic process under UN Security Council Resolution 2254, because it's the nature of the Assad regime, the nature of the Iranian regime that continually gives space for some of these other terrorist organizations to thrive, and we're not going to be able to get to an enduring end of those groups until the war on which they sort of ride is finished. I'll stop there, Glenn. I probably went on longer than advertised, so I apologize for that.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you very much, Joel. You were also made a trip to Israel, and I was wondering about what your discussions with Israel were. I mean, it's obvious that Iran came up, and so what type of conversations did you have there?
We've been having a very extensive conversation nearly continuously with our Israeli counterparts, and Iran is the centerpiece. It's that phenomenon I mentioned where the Iranian regime has been trying to build a strategic road into Syria, across Syria, and then establish power projection platforms in Syria that they can use against Syria's neighbors. That is the number one concern in the Syrian conflict for the Israelis. We support their right to defend themselves against that network and to try to prevent it from being fully established. And they're doing that. They're placing a lot of military pressure on what the Iranians are trying to do, but the Iranians haven't given up. This is sort of the dream of Qasem Soleimani, which he began to execute. What I saw in early 2017, when he sort of pulled his forces out of the internal conflict in Syria and began and focused almost entirely on establishing strategic bases in this strategic road so that he could open another front against the Israelis, but also use it against other Syrian neighbors. And that's the thing that we talk about with the Israelis is how can we synchronize our actions? How can we coordinate our overall policies to try to make sure that Iranian power projection network doesn't get up and running in full force.
And what was the results of in the discussions about Hezbollah? You mentioned going into Golan. I mean, there's networks. How does that play?
Hezbollah is they're the proxy through which the Iranians try to establish themselves in a lot of places. I would say, the Iranians themselves, the Iranian forces themselves, are not that close to Israel. In my experience, they're back from the border a little ways. Sometimes they concentrate. There are a lot of them out in the Euphrates Valley. There are a lot of them in central Syria and in places like Tias Air Base. And the ones who are up on the Israeli frontier, that's more Hezbollah. But they're there for Iranian purposes. They're there to try to establish a close threat in the Syria-Israel border zone.
And what can you tell us about Russian and Syrian counterterrorism? I mean, how are they doing anything to counterterrorism in Syria?
I would say the Assad regime and the Russians are making the terrorism problem in Syria worse by the things that they do. If you look at, Idlib is the case in point. There were a gazillion, many airstrikes, artillery strikes, ground attacks that were focused not on terrorist organizations, but on civilian populations or civilian infrastructure or armed groups that were in opposition to the terrorist groups. You could see, a really radical group would be at war with an element of the Free Syrian Army, and the Russians and the Assad regime are bombing the Free Syrian Army, even while they're being attacked by the more extremist elements. And that was true in southern Syria as well. There were times where we watched Russian or Syrian regime aircraft fly over the ISIS branch that was down there in order to bomb the Free Syrian Army. At the same time that the ISIS guys are attacking the Free Syrian Army, it's almost as though the Assad regime is in a military coalition with those people. So I don't see that the Russians and the Assad regime have done much to help the counterterrorism cause in northwest Syria. They've exacerbated it. They've driven more people, I think, more into the arms of the extremist groups because the civilian population has been desperate for defense. Out in the Badia Desert, I don't see that the problem that you have there is that there are a lot of ISIS to be handled, but the Syrian regime chooses to leave all the bulk of its combat power up in the northwest. So troops that it could be and should be using to prevent an ISIS resurgence out in eastern and central Syria are instead on the front lines in Idlib, where essentially they're just there to try to keep pressure on the Idlib pocket and to create 3 million more refugees or so, and be blackmailing against Turkey and the European Union and so on. So I'm pretty down on the idea of Assad or the Russians as counter-terrorists.
Do you think that the Syrian forces took a pretty big beating in February during the campaign to try to take Idlib when the Turkish drone attacks pretty much took out a lot of the Syrian army and Russian forces as well?
Yeah, they did. I think you have to say, it was unequivocal. The Syrian regime military suffered a significant defeat at the hands of the Turkish military and the Syrian opposition fighters that the Turks support. When you came down to, and we watched it almost hour by hour unfold on our team in state and with our military counterparts. And when we got to the last days of that confrontation, I want to say it was March 1st or 2nd, somewhere around in there. There was a moment where the Syrian Army's 25th Division and its forces and some of the Republican Guard had broken and had fled east of the highway that runs from Hama to Aleppo, and there was nothing really nothing significant on the road between the town of Sarakib and Aleppo. The highway was effectively open while the Turks and their Syrian opposition allies were conducting a counterattack. So the only thing that stopped them was that the Quds Force and Hezbollah organized an infantry counterattack, a desperate one, about 1,200 fighters that they scraped together. It included Iranians, Lebanese, and Afghans. And they counterattacked and stopped the Turks and their Syrian opposition allies from taking that important town. But if that hadn't happened, I mean, there's no reason why to think, and my judgment was, had those battles gone on and that Turkish counterattack gone on for another week or two, I think that the Syrian army would have been wiped out in the north, or certainly rendered, completely ineffective. And there's no reason why the Turks couldn't have begun to approach Aleppo and retake it, or threaten the Aleppo airport or something like that. And so that was a narrow escape for the Assad regime military. So I do not see them tangling with the Turkish military again, because it would be almost suicidal based on what we saw in February and March.
And what was the so you're saying now that you don't think that Syrian army's recovered from that?
No, I don't. I mean, the military balance in the Northwest, I think, shifted permanently.
Are they?
There's no way the Syrian regime can reconstitute forces. I mean, the cupboard is bare, and there's just nothing to draw upon.
So you're saying cupboard's bare, meaning reference to manpower?
Manpower, and I would say, their hardware. They lost so much in that campaign, and they would lose so much again if they took on the Turkish military and their Syrian partners again. That, I mean, it's just not replaceable for them. They're just tapped out. They've got nothing to pay for it with, and it's just their manpower. Also, their manpower problem is acute. They really don't have any reservoir of manpower to draw on, other than trying to get the opposition to be conscripted into their own ranks, and that's not a recipe for a coherent force.
And it's my understanding there's still about 10,000 Turkish troops still in Idlib. Is that?
I would say there's more than that. Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a bit. What are our possibilities of improving CT coordination with Turkey? Are there ways it can be improved?
Yeah, of course. I would defer to DoD to go into my military counterparts to go into much specifics there. I would say that it doesn't happen very much. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement because we don't have great mechanisms right now. And in addition, the Turks are following a strategy in northwest Syria of trying to reduce the space that the radical groups can operate in over time. And that could be, I think, synchronized with the kind of things that the global coalition can do over time. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of room where we could cooperate if we could set up a mechanism for it.
Is the de-escalation hotline with the Russians still working? Because some of the videos I've seen of the Russians trying to ram American military forces, it doesn't show that it's working. That's
really calmed down. One of the reasons that it calmed down was because we showed a lot of resolve. I have to credit our military counterparts for being very firm in response to those Russian provocations. So we got an update on that on Monday, and things are vastly different than they were in the late summer. It doesn't hurt that the U.S. military folks that are out there on the ground have a unit of Bradley fighting vehicles with them, which are the most powerful military hardware in eastern Syria, and so it would be unwise for another force to mess around with the coalition troops out there.
So you're saying the Bradley fighting vehicle is a very good measure for teaching the Russians road safety in Syria, then?
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Plus, what I mean, I would say, Glenn, I'll just add that, at a diplomatic level, we were very clear with our Russian counterparts that that kind of low tactical activity endangers, threatens to risks causing tension at the strategic level, and that's not something that I think they want.
Definitely, and I think there's times when I wish I would have had Bradley driving down the Beltway. So anyway, listen, thank you very much, Joel. I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Bruce Hoffman. And Bruce, let you kind of share your thoughts on the CT challenges to the administration. I think Joel's kind of given us a very good overview of where we are in Syria and elsewhere.
Great, thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Joel, for those remarks. Let me build off something that Joel had said, and also talk about ISIS and Al Qaeda in that respect. I think the point that Joel emphasized is absolutely right, that the physical manifestation of the Islamic State and the Caliphate that they established has been defeated. But as the most recent iteration of the U.S. national strategy for counterterrorism observed, that despite those tremendous successes, even while the center of ISIS has contracted, the periphery has been expanded. And that document spoke of 8 official branches and more than 24 networks that have survived even the collapse of the Caliphate and the Islamic State in the Levant and Western Iraq. And what we see is that over the past 2 years, ISIS has actually been expanding elsewhere, to Indonesia, to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chad, Cameroon, and I think most alarmingly to Mozambique, a country that is in southeastern Africa that really hadn't had any experience of terrorism and insurgency in some decades. And in a fairly short span of time over the past 3 years, it's been able to amass something like 300 to 3,500 or so fighters, and to become increasingly more disciplined and consequential. Just last month, there was widespread beheadings, for instance. And that's what concerns me, is that we can talk about ISIS being 100% defeated or being wiped out, but there are still radical entities in a number of different countries that are completely prepared to hitch their fortunes to what we see as a falling star, and that's quite worrisome. Within that context, I think we expected that the repercussions of the masterful killing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, ISIS's founder, or at least that iteration of a group that has a long lineage in Iraq, that his killing would have more profound repercussions. I think what we found, somewhat to our surprise, is that in very short order, ISIS had a successor waiting in the wings who was appointed, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi, which struck me as evidence of at least ISIS's continued appeal, if not vitality, is over the next 8 weeks or so, every single one of those ISIS branches or networks swore allegiance, offered the pledge of bayat to al-Qurashi. So ISIS, is not rudderless or not without a command. And this is part of the problem. I think we've been very effective, and in fact, the Trump administration in particular has been highly effective at killing terrorist leaders. Over a half dozen, for instance, have perished over the past 2 years of both ISIS and Al Qaeda. Al-Baghdadi, Aslam Faruqi, in Al Qaeda's case, Qasim al-Rimi, Abdul Malik Truktel, Hamza bin Laden, of course, Khalid al-Ruri, and so on. But this is the problem, is that these groups know that is one of our chief strategies, is decapitation. And they've put in place, I think, fairly robust succession plans that go beyond just one person, and that these groups are able to survive even the loss of their founders and leaders. Obviously, the killing of Osama bin Laden nearly a decade ago is a case in point. So I think that's sort of a salutary message that leadership decapitation is one of the essential elements and tools in counterterrorism, but it's one that can't be overly relied upon to produce long-lasting results. And that's why I think as we discussed the other day, Glenn, the supposed allegation, or the supposed killing, or the allegations about Ayman al-Zawahiri's death, not a targeted killing, but its supposed death from natural causes. I mean, unfortunately, at this stage of the struggle, I think the impact is somewhat limited. One more thing about ISIS before I move on to al-Qaeda, I would call everyone's attention or remind them about an excellent article that was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in September, which astonishingly indicated that ISIS, at least according to the Department of the Treasury, still has cash reserves of upwards of $300 million. United Nations puts it at only about a third of that. But the point is, these are terrorist groups that have the leadership, depth, and unfortunately still the finances to carry on their struggles, which in my view indicates that the long war, the stupid endless wars, are not close to being over. At least our adversaries have voted to continue the struggle. Very briefly, in al-Qaeda's case, we can go on and on about that it's just a shadow of its former self, or that it's being eliminated, or it's irrelevant. But I think, as I said last year at the Jamestown conference in 2019, that if Osama bin Laden were alive today, he'd likely be a happy man, because he has seen the enterprise that he began over 30 years ago continue, despite the greatest onslaught directed against the terrorist group in the history of mankind by the most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind. And at least as part of al-Qaeda's narrative, the fact that it celebrated its 32nd anniversary just last August means it's not going away as easily as we would assume, or that some might argue. A couple of years ago, the Global Extremism Monitor in London reported that there are about 121 violent Salafi jihadist groups active throughout the world. Seth's own excellent work about 2 months later cited a lower figure. Well, it depends how you count. He said 67, but I thought that the CSIS conclusion that this represented a 180% increase from 9/11 2001 was somewhat stunning. For my own calculation, if you look at sort of the gold standard metric, which is the US State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations, there's 4 times as many Salafi jihadi terrorist groups on that list than there were 19 years ago. So clearly, this is a threat that isn't fading. I don't want to talk too much longer, but let me highlight one point that does concern me. Much of what I've discussed, and of course even what Joel is discussing, are indeed local, or in many cases regional threats, which of course in key vital geostrategic areas like South Asia can have very profound repercussions. I mean, I think we avoided a very dangerous escalation in 2008 with the attacks on Mumbai by Lashkar-e-Taiba. So all these groups have enormous potential for destabilizing and undermining US allies, and also entrenching themselves even more. But I would also argue there's a tactical dimension to this. At least from my studies of terrorism, terrorist groups are the most dangerous when they have access to sanctuary and safe haven. And I think it's indisputable that whether it's al-Qaeda or whether it's ISIS, nowadays they probably have more access to sanctuary and safe haven than they've had at any time in the past. And I think anyone who wants to breathe a sigh of relief that the threat, even a 9/11 type threat, has receded. We just have to remember that twice in the past year, al-Shabaab operatives were arrested, once in the Philippines and another time in an undisclosed African country, taking flight lessons. And that's one of the things about our adversaries, is we may all be taught in university that history doesn't repeat itself, but as part of their narrative, as part of what they see as their divinely ordained struggle, they unfortunately attempt to replicate history and to fall back on what they see is proven tactics. So, in conclusion, I think, as a new administration takes office, historically, most governments prefer to ignore the terrorism threat. It's a distraction. This struggle in particular has now lasted for nearly 2 decades. So there's tremendous enervation. I think it's been remarkable that this is a nonpartisan issue. I think on both sides, we want to draw down military forces overseas. But in countering terrorism, we're always left with the perennial question of, how much is enough? And how do we strike a balance between contending priorities in challenges? I mean, obviously, I think we learned over a decade ago that invading and occupying countries with hundreds of thousands of troops was too much and was not the right answer. At the same time, at least I have to believe that naught or zero is also not the right answer, and that when 0.3% of DoD personnel are assigned to Africa, for instance, and the vast majority of them are in Djibouti in any event, is that too much? I mean, or is that enough? That I think is the main question. And the second main question is, we're only as good as the last attack that we've prevented, and is what we're doing now ensure that we're not becoming overly complacent and that we maintain our vigilance. The terrorist threat itself is nonlinear. It's something that ebbs and flows, and therefore our responses have to be just as flexible, but at the same time, and dynamic, but at the same time, have to understand that the terrorists haven't laid down their arms and the threat has not abated. I mean, in my view, of course, there are competitors for our national security focus right now. Even as a terrorism specialist, I think that the preponderant focus was often on terrorism, was misdirected. But the point is, it's a fixture of national and international security in the 21st century, and it's not going away. And the problem is, terrorism is a strategy of provocation, and the next successful attack will erase, or arguably erase, all the success that we've hitherto experienced, which I think has been considerable. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Very much always appreciate your comments and insights. Seth, would you like to weigh in now and share your comments and views?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Let me just build a little bit on what Joel and Bruce have both talked about, but take it in a slightly different direction. And what I'm going to argue is that, like it or not, the terrorism challenge is going to persist for at least two major reasons. One of them, which sort of turns the great power competition discussion in a sense on its head, and that is, I'm going to argue, I think, and there's a fair amount of historical evidence to support this, that competition, particularly between nuclear powers, and if you add the Iranians, at least powers that have pretty sophisticated cruise and ballistic missile capabilities, and certainly have some ambitions to build nuclear weapons. What it does is it drives a lot of the competition into the irregular arena. That's the first. And that includes relationships, as we'll see, with terrorist and other non-state organizations, including private military companies. The second is that look at where most of the terrorism that Bruce and Joel highlighted exists. The challenge is that they're in countries with weak government. So if one of the things that I like to do is sort of overlay where we see Islamic State and Al-Qaeda attacks across the globe, really from parts of Northwest East Africa through the Middle East into South Asia and into Southeast Asia. You overlay that with the World Bank governance indicators, particularly the government effectiveness one. And what you actually see is virtually all of those countries are in the bottom 0 to 10% of effectiveness. And as you get down to those low levels, what that means is there's almost no functioning government. But I think for those two reasons, there's going to be a lot of churn over the next couple of years, I think, for the new administration. That terrorism is going to persist. Let me take the first argument and explore this issue of competition. I think when you look at the Cold War history, and this is really the problem, it's that the major powers, the Chinese and the Russians, have nuclear weapons. And I think it's certainly plausible, I think it's advisable for the US to be preparing for conventional and even nuclear war with these countries. But what we saw during the last 2 decades of the Cold War, including after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was there's a lot of hesitation to fight each other and expand influence and power through conventional or nuclear means, because it does risk escalation. And when you escalate to the nuclear level, you're risking your own cities. So what it led to is competition at the sub-state, including the non-state level, including in the third world. And I think that's what, as I look at some of the major adversaries, I would say this is exactly what we're seeing over the last couple of years, the direction they're going in. So let's take Russia first. So in 2014, Russia seizes Crimea, largely with its own special operations and intelligence units, including the KSO, Russian Special Operations. And then in particular, what's interesting is the insurgency then that they get going in eastern Ukraine, including the Donbass, where they essentially support insurgent organizations, and where Ukraine, including eastern Ukraine, over the next couple of years, and some of the work that the Sufan group has done highlights this as well, is eastern Ukraine, and actually parts of western Ukraine for that matter, have become locations not just for jihadists, but also for white supremacists and other groups that have come from the Caucasus, that come from Eastern and Western Europe to fight and gain some expertise. If you move on to 2015, it's the year that the Russians in the fall become directly involved in the Syrian war. And I think this is a fascinating case because the Russians obviously do something very different from the 1980s war in Afghanistan. Instead of sending in large numbers of conventional forces, they sent in over 100,000 into Afghanistan. They leverage Syrian higher-end units like the Tiger units, but then they work directly with the Quds Force to leverage as maneuver units on the ground Lebanese Hezbollah, a U.S. designated terrorist organization that's killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers in Lebanon and other countries. And then they also work on the ground at the maneuver level with Afghan fighters, with Pakistani, with Iraqi, with some Palestinian, and then other Lebanese. So what you get is the Russians making a very concrete decision in Syria to work with terrorist and other non-state organizations to protect the Assad regime. And I think what this does is it shows us that as part of this aspect of competition, states are increasingly willing to work with organizations. I mean, I would just add to that last example, and I don't want to overstate this one, but the Russian decision starting in at least 2016 or 2017, as my friend Mick Nicholson briefed at the time in open source forums. He was the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. U.S. intelligence confirmed that Russia was providing some assistance to the Taliban, the group we're fighting in Afghanistan and negotiating with today. And I think if you expand that to concerns about Russian assistance for Taliban kinetic operations in 2020, which surfaced in news articles, and you look at the Russian use of private military companies like the Wagner Group, what we see is states increasingly willing to do this. Joel noted the Iranians. I don't need to go down the same road, except just to re-emphasize that we see Quds Force willingness to work with not just Lebanese Hezbollah, Hashd al-Shabi, some of the groups in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, including getting Hezbollah to provide train, advise, and assist, including ballistic missile, and cruise missile, and UAV capabilities in Yemen, including to target Saudi Arabia from Yemeni soil. So these are two major adversaries working directly with terrorist organizations on the ground. And you know, my judgment is that this will continue to be a very important part of competition that the U.S. faces in the foreseeable future. And what it really argues against is that we can make these black or white judgments that, you know, as some sort of concluded with the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, that we can shift from countering terrorist organizations to great power competition, as if those two are necessarily separate entities. And I think the argument here is that in fact, they can be quite compatible, at least with some of the groups. The second issue, just to highlight what I noted before, is Joel and Bruce both talked about concerns about Al-Qaeda and Islamic State activity, including in Syria, in a range of other places. I'll add a little bit more of a discussion on Afghanistan to this as well. But let me just highlight that my own research on insurgencies, 200 insurgencies since World War II, suggests that 3 sets of factors generally increase the probability: grievances, weak governance, and greed. And I think what's concerning to me is we see areas where groups like the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda can continue to operate. There are plenty of opportunities for leveraging local grievances. There are plenty of opportunities for establishing funding mechanisms, and there are plenty of areas for weak governance. We just walk through a few of those real briefly. If we take a look at issues related to governance challenges, just to highlight that, I mean, as Joel already noted, in Syria, the Assad regime does not either control or has or is willing to provide the capabilities to push forces in, nor have the Russians been willing to do it in areas like the Badia Desert. If you look at just the overall government effectiveness of Syria right now, World Bank puts it at the bottom 2% of countries worldwide. It's essentially almost a governance-less country right now, at least in chunks of the country. If we look at any of the areas that we've seen attacks recently by Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, Yemen, Afghanistan, Libya, Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, these all rank in the bottom 10%, and many of them are in the bottom 0 to 2% of government effectiveness in the world. And the challenge there is, and this gets kind of to the so what of all of this, as the U.S. downsizes, pulls out many of its forces from Somalia, as it pulls out and goes down to 2,500 or so in Afghanistan, I think this raises a lot of prospects for potential resurgence if we're not careful. And if we take sort of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, just to highlight an example here, the numbers aren't huge. They're probably in the less than 1,000 category under Al-Qaeda in the Islamic, in the Indian subcontinent, AQIS, in the Afghan-Pakistan border areas. And the U.S. and the Afghan government have killed some senior AQIS leaders, including Hossam Abdul al-Rauf, who went by the name of Abu Muhsin al-Masri. But I think what's important to note is that Al-Qaeda continues to have strategic, operational, and tactical level relations with the Taliban, not just at the Taliban Rabari Shura or the Senior Leadership Shura, but also with Taliban commanders at the local level. So we've seen at least small cells of Al-Qaeda operatives in Badakhshan, Ghazni, Helmand, Khost, Kunar, Kunduz, Logar, Nangarhar, Nimruz, Nuristan, Paktia, and Zabul, just to highlight a few examples. The question becomes, as the U.S. Continues to pull out its forces from Afghanistan, and I think if we take a gauge right now as to where the peace process is, we've really gotten almost nowhere since the February peace agreement was signed between the U.S. and the Taliban, and the negotiations then started between the Afghan government and the Taliban this fall. We've made very little progress. Nothing that looks like an agreement is going to happen anytime in the foreseeable future. So as the U.S. pulls out, I think this raises a lot of questions about Taliban military advances. I mean, they've raised the same kinds of questions. There's a phenomenal UN Security Council report from earlier this year that highlights continuing Al-Qaeda and Taliban relationship over the course of the peace process, I mean, what's been really interesting, this was member states that provided the intelligence to the UN Security Council report. What it indicated was that at various parts of the negotiations, even as the Taliban was talking about potentially breaking links with Al-Qaeda, it was saying behind the scenes, don't worry, we are not going to break links with you. You know, some potential discussions on don't plot attacks, external attacks from Afghan soil. But I mean, we've seen Al-Qaeda pretty active in working with local commanders in Afghanistan. So I think the argument, just to bring these two issues back together as we walk into a new administration, is that we have states, some of whom were in the terrorism business before, are back in, or at least in more than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And again, I think it's going to be a very important part of competition, in part because nuclear and conventional war do not make much sense. Too much blood, too much treasure, and that pushes a lot of this competition down to the irregular level. Among other things, as we saw during the Cold War too, that has meant working with terrorist organizations. And the second is, again, almost all the areas we're seeing groups operate right now, there's almost no significant government. So I think in that sense, we're in this one for the long run, whether we want to or not. So I think with that somewhat grim assessment, Glenn, I will hand this back to you.
Thank you, Seth. That was quite grim, but I would like to ask you, we had a panel yesterday on Afghanistan, and two of our Afghan experts, both were very much proud of the fact that the Afghan army is not the Afghan army of 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The Afghan army is now much more highly capable than it used to be, and that they are not as pessimistic as some people about a U.S. withdrawal suddenly leading to a collapse. They believe that there's some small level left of U.S. forces to support it, that they can hold their own against the Taliban. Now, that's their thinking. Do you think that there's a certain level of improvement in the Afghan forces?
Well, I think the Afghan National Army, and you know, I've spent a lot of time with particularly elements of the Afghan National Army for the last various parts of the last 20 years. They've gotten much better, particularly the high-end forces like the commandos. I mean, they are very capable of hitting targets, conducting what we would call in the U.S. foreign internal defense and unconventional warfare. They've been overused because they've been so competent. The police forces are still a very mixed bag. I think the concern that I have is if we were to go much lower than 2,500, we start to shift the balance of power in Afghanistan, because the way I see it is we've got roughly a stalemate right now. The Taliban don't control any major urban centers. They don't control a provincial capital. They certainly don't control Kabul, though they can conduct attacks inside of them. Anytime they've tried to control a city like in Kunduz, they just haven't been able to hold it. But there's a balance right now, and we have the Afghan government, Afghan National Security and Defense Forces, with support from the US and the Europeans. And on the other side, we've got the Taliban with support from Pakistan, including its Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, and some Russian assistance and some Iranian assistance. One of the major regional shuras actually the Taliban have is in Iran. So they've got leadership structure on the Iranian and in particular the Pakistan side of the border. So that outside assistance for the Taliban is not going to end, in my view, in the foreseeable future. A major decrease in a U.S. presence and U.S. capabilities, if that were to happen, I think would shift the balance in favor of the Taliban and would provide an opportunity for them to continue to increase their control of territory, which they have done. Now, whether that means they overthrow the government in Kabul next year, or whether they just are able to seize a provincial capital, I think is an open question. But I am not that optimistic if the U.S. presence continues to decline from its 2,500 level.
Thank you. Joel, I wanted to ask you a question. And for those who are watching today, we're going to please start using the chat feature to ask us some questions if you have of any of the speakers today. Joel, I wanted to ask you, you said that you were recently in Syria. What is the mood among the SDF or YPG from your discussions there? Are they still very optimistic? Are they less optimistic?
I think concerning ISIS and the potential for stabilizing the territories liberated from ISIS, I think they are optimistic. I think our military counterparts are optimistic about that. What anxiety they have is over things like I mentioned the issue of the IDPs that either fled the last shrinking bit of the caliphate, or they were essentially citizens of the caliphate, and the fact that they're still there, gathered densely in IDP camps, or the foreign fighters in detention facilities. That's a big worry for the people of the Northeast. I think a second worry that they have is they all see that the durability of the victory over ISIS and stability and peace, the prospects for stability and peace in the Northeast, are linked to the larger the question of the broader conflict in Syria. The need for a political solution that compensates for all the damage that the Assad regime and its allies have done. They're very concerned about the political path forward for Syria and the place of the northeastern region in it. And they're also concerned about the ongoing tensions between Turkey and the PKK, and the potential that conflict could, the risk that conflict could spill over into northeastern Syria in ways that it has before, and could cause real problems for the common interest that we have of trying to stabilize that territory and make it so that ISIS or other radical groups can't come back, or that the Assad regime and the Iranian regime can't have space to try to reach into northeastern Syria and destabilize it beyond what they've done so far. So they're optimistic on the campaign itself. I would say they're anxious and looking for greater definition on the political future and the broader and the risks that they have to that they take some of the blowback from that Turkey PKK conflict.
We have a question for you, Joel, from Terry Wolf, who's asked, well, I know this is outside of your responsibility, but are you also confident in the ISF's ability to deal with the clandestine ISIS threat, as well as the GOI's governance challenges?
It's such a coincidence that the questioner is named Terry Wolf, because we used to have a deputy Secchi envoy by the same name, who was a great Army lieutenant general with a lot of experience. So the question is on the ISF, the Iraqi security forces. I'm less plugged into the situation on the Iraq side of the house. What I can say, I mean, historically, and Terry knows this because he lived it in Baghdad and in Secchi. It's tough. It's tough for the ISF to go. The ISF proved itself to be, especially the counterterrorism forces, a really effective tool against ISIS as a field army. And now, however, with ISIS being destroyed as a field army and adapting into a different mode, this clandestine mode, now we run into a place where the ISF historically, it's not been the strength of theirs, and not both because of the culture, but also because of the traditionally they haven't had the kind of high-end capabilities to draw on that we do and that other coalition partners do. So intelligence-driven activities, the need to have very effective law enforcement efforts alongside that. But the biggest thing, not just the ISF, but the Iraqi state, the Iraqi government, to be able to try to handle the political conflict that underlies the military conflict, in that ISIS and its forerunner Al Qaeda in Iraq have always been able to use. So I think it's in that phase, that follow-on phase, that phase 4, if you want to call it, stabilization phase, where things become really, really tough, which is why I think you're going to see a very strong demand signal for the global coalition to remain intact and to continue assisting the local security partners in both Iraq and Syria in this stabilization phase, because a lot of the things that you need to do to be effective are things that the local security partners don't really possess. And that's what the global coalition can bring to the table in both countries.
You mentioned earlier this incubating caliphate, and I have a question, because I know that those camps there in Syria have a very large population. I think some estimates are 10,000, I think. Are they?
Oh, no, much more than that.
Much
more than that. Yeah, the Al-Hol camp, for example, has around 70,000.
So why is it that these people are not being repatriated, or why is it that, you know, European partners are not stepping to the plate to do something with this?
Well, you know, it's different for different countries, but the biggest portion of the inhabitants of Al-Hol camp are Iraqis, and the vast majority of them don't want to go back to Iraq. And the Iraqi government, it has so far has been a bit reluctant to set up a mechanism for working with us and the SDF to begin repatriating them. Hopefully, I mean, there's an initiative underway, and hopefully that'll change in the future. Concerning the European governments, and this is something that Terry and Brett McGurk, who were the team in charge of SECI at that time, you know, several years ago, encountered as well, is that a lot of the European countries in particular are reluctant to repatriate ISIS fighters who are their citizens back to Europe. For a variety of reasons. There's some political cost to that, I think some of them calculate, but also in some places there is real variance. There's a differential in different places for the strength of counterterrorism laws, and the ability to prove that what they did in Iraq and Syria by joining ISIS and et cetera, can be prosecuted back in their countries in a meaningful way, or in a way that it's not just people are being held by the SDF and have been, let's say, for a couple of years, that they don't go back to Europe and are convicted of something, but the legal penalties are so low that maybe they're released for time served, or they don't serve very long, and then they're right back out on the streets. I think some of the European governments are concerned about that. They don't have the legal framework to account for the phenomenon. A lot of them are, and they know that, I think a lot of the European countries, but that's what makes it difficult. It's not just Europe, it's the same in some of the Arab countries and others, but it's going to take a lot of diplomatic energy to overcome those hurdles and try to reduce that foreign fighter population.
We have a question for you, Joel. What could the U.S. government do to prevent ISIS operations in southern Syria? There's a fear that their presence is on the rise there.
I think that's a good question, because we don't have military presence there. Of course, you know, I mean, we and in sometimes acting with coalition partners, we'll go where we need to defeat a threat. We will always do that. But what's really, I think, from the State Department side, we need to be able to use our political and economic pressure tools against the Assad regime, against the Iranians, and to try to press the Russians not to make the situation worse. I mean, Hezbollah is down there, they're recruiting fighters and so on, and that's the source of a lot of conflict. These are zones where the Russians were supposed to broker local peace agreements, and they haven't held up their end of the bargain to guarantee those agreements, and the Assad regime has driven a lot of people back into on the defensive. So I would say probably what we need to do more of is to use our pressure tools on that political level. I can't answer for the military side of it. I'm sure, you know, there are people out there who are thinking of that.
Seth, do you want to take this question from Asin Khan? It says, is the U.S. engaging Russia, Pakistan, Iran on counterterrorism cooperation in Afghanistan in relation to AQ and ISIL. What kind of CBMs could be employed? How are dynamics right now in multilateral forums on terrorism threats and CP actions?
Thanks. Well, no, the answer at this point is no, not really, certainly not in any meaningful way, particularly with the Russians and the Iranians. In fact, in some cases, quite the opposite. Having dealt a lot with Central Asian directors of military intelligence, they have noted on many occasions that the Russians continue to push information that the U.S. is directly funding the Islamic State Khorasan province in Afghanistan along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. So the Russians, it's not just that we're not cooperating with them, they're not necessarily being helpful, even though they are concerned, as are the Iranians concerned, particularly about the ISIL threat. The primary focus on targeting ISIL comes on the one hand from the Afghan government and its commandos and Tejas and other high-end forces, and primarily U.S. Special Operations Forces, the special mission units that are conducting attacks against ISIS. And actually, they've been effective in some areas. ISIS is actually pretty weak in Afghanistan compared to what it was just a few years ago. It's probably down to about 2,200 fighters, which is down from somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 just a few years ago. They have largely lost control of most of the territory in Nangarhar province and have been pushed up into places like Kunar and some smaller numbers in Badakhshan and a few other places. But no meaningful cooperation with the Russians or the Iranians. There is some discussion with Pakistan, but the broader state of U.S.-Pakistan counterterrorism cooperation is nothing like what it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, particularly regarding Al-Qaeda, at least Pakistan permitting the U.S. to fly unmanned aerial vehicles into parts of Pakistan, the federally administered tribal areas, to conduct attacks. So, some history of working against Al-Qaeda. But I think, are there opportunities for cooperation? Yes, possibly, particularly with Pakistan. I just think with Russia and Iran is probably a bridge too far. But there are other areas, drug trafficking, for example, that there may be avenues for cooperation, including with the Russians. A lot of the drugs in Afghanistan go up through Central Asia and into Russia. I think Pakistan's probably the one organization, or the one country where there still is some possibility for meaningful cooperation with groups like the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan that have conducted attacks on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistan border. But again, not really the Russians and certainly not the Iranians right now.
Well, I got a question for you, for both. I want to ask Joe. I'll ask him to avoid talking about the Biden administration policies. But for you, Seth and Bruce, if the Biden administration is planning to revive the JPCOA and engage Iran, as CT experts, how do you perceive this? What would be the fallout of this in Syria and Lebanon with Iran? I mean, do you think that some golden plan with Iran that by the Biden administration was something to result in a kinder, gentler Iran in Syria and Lebanon?
Well, I mean, you can't walk the cat back in many respects. I think the JCPOA did empower Iran, at least financially, to become much more active in destabilization activities and other nefarious activities in the region. I think the question about a revived JCPOA is what sort of guardrails and safeties can be put into place to prevent yet another resurgence after all, at a time when when Iranian influence is already expanded.
I'll just add to that. I think my concern is what happens outside of any kind of a nuclear agreement. And I think the challenge with Iran is, and I think they learned this after suffering enormous casualties during the Iran-Iraq War, is that they are not a conventional power. They're not going to be a conventional power. In fact, if you look at some of their battle tanks and their aircraft, they're from the Shah period. They're actually American aircraft and some American tanks. What they do have is irregular asymmetric capabilities. So let's just say, in general, there is an agreement and there's progress on a nuclear agreement. Well, what does that mean with the Quds Force, which has expanded its area of operations in Syria, still active in Yemen? I think as the U.S. pulls out, or at least downsizes in Afghanistan, the Quds Force is very active. Actually, it's one of the primary areas that Ismail Khani, Qasem Soleimani's successor, I mean, it's one of the areas he has historically knows best. So I think what this suggests, and if we had the missile program, I think the problem any Biden administration is going to have is, how does it deal with the other parts of the Iranian threat? I mean, it has to be more than just a nuclear agreement.
We have we're certainly going to give the prize for the most number of questions today to Terry Wolf, who's very, he wanted to ask you a question of Bruce and Seth. The ISIS and AQ groups are filling these poorly governed spaces opportunistically. So how should we adjust and build upon our existing VEO CT strategies? What investments would you suggest for the next administration?
You want Bruce to start, or?
I think Bruce has got to sign off. So if you could briefly answer that, and we'll try to end the discussion.
Terry, we may have to have this offline. It's a long answer to the question.
Okay. All right. Let's just do that. And we'll go ahead and finish it today because Bruce has another event. Joel, Bruce, and Seth, thank you very much for joining us today. Great honor and privilege. And we're very happy that you could help contribute to our 14th Annual Terrorism Conference. We're going to have another panel for those still watching tomorrow at 11 a.m. on U.S. domestic terrorism threats here and influences abroad. And Bruce will be moderating that. So thank you everyone for participating, and best of luck and happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Thanks, Glenn. Masalama.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Joel.
All right. Thanks, Seth.